When my daughter-in-law handed me a cardboard box and told me to take my junk and get out, I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because inside that box, the one she packed herself, the one she'd carried down the stairs and dropped at my feet like I was something she'd found on the curb, was something she had no idea about. Something that was about to change everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it really began. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years as an electrician in Columbus, Ohio. Union work, good work, the kind where you come home with your hands sore and your back aching, but you know you did something real that day. My wife Patricia and I built a life in this city from nothing. We bought our house on Meadowbrook Drive in 1989 for $94,000. We painted every room ourselves. We planted a vegetable garden in the backyard that she tended like it was a third child. We raised our son Nolan in that house. Watched him grow from a skinny little kid who was afraid of thunderstorms into a man who stood 6'2" and had his mother's eyes. Patricia passed from ovarian cancer in 2019. That's not something I talk about lightly, and I won't dwell on it here. But you need to know that when she died, that house became the most important thing I had left. Every scratch on the kitchen floor, every uneven stair on the back porch, Patricia was in all of it. I was not going to sell that house. I had told Nolan that plainly. This house stays in the family. He understood. At the time, Nolan married Stacy in the fall of 2021. I liked her well enough at the wedding. She was charming, laughed easily, knew how to work a room. She came from a family in Westerville with a little money. Not a lot, but enough that she'd never had to think too hard about it. I noticed early on that she had opinions about things. Strong opinions. About where Nolan should work, what neighborhood they should live in, what kind of car was appropriate for a man in his position. I didn't say anything. He was happy. That was what mattered. They were renting a 2-bedroom apartment in Clintonville when Nolan lost his job in the spring of 2022. The marketing firm he'd been with for 4 years had a round of layoffs and he was caught in it. I told him not to worry. Come stay with me while you get back on your feet, I said. The house is too big for just me anyway. That was my mistake. Not saying it, I'd say it again. The mistake was not paying attention to what came through the door with them. They moved in on a Saturday in April. I remember because the forsythia in the front yard was blooming and Patricia had loved those yellow branches every spring. I helped them carry boxes. I made room in the garage. I gave them the whole upstairs, 2 bedrooms, the big bathroom with the clawfoot tub Patricia had insisted on when we remodeled. I took the small bedroom downstairs next to the kitchen, the one that used to be Nolan's when he was small. I told myself it was temporary, 6 months maybe, a year at the outside. The first few months weren't bad. Nolan was interviewing, staying busy. Stacy worked from home. Something in insurance, I was never entirely clear on the details. We had dinner together most nights. I cooked more than I probably should have, because cooking had always been how I took care of people, and I needed that. Patricia used to say, I expressed love through food. She wasn't wrong. The shift started so slowly, I almost didn't notice it. Little things at first. Stacy rearranged the living room without asking me. I mentioned it once, gently, and she looked at me with this patient expression, like I was a child who didn't understand something. It just flows better this way, she said. You'll get used to it. I let it go. Then she started making comments about the house. Not mean exactly, but pointed. How dated the kitchen was, how the windows needed replacing, how the neighborhood had a lot of potential, which I'd learned was a phrase people used when they meant the neighbors they could see weren't the right kind. I'd lived on that street for 33 years, and I knew every single person within 4 houses in either direction. The Johnsons next door had brought me a casserole when Patricia died. I wasn't going to hear them described as potential. By fall, Nolan had found a new position. Lower pay than before, but solid, with a company that made industrial equipment. I expected them to start looking for their own place. Instead, Stacy started talking about investing in the house, updating the kitchen, converting the garage into a proper workspace, making the backyard more functional. I realized she wasn't talking about helping me fix my house. She was talking about improving property she'd already begun to think of as hers. One evening after dinner, Nolan sat down with me at the kitchen table. He had that look he'd had since he was a teenager when he had to say something he knew I wouldn't like. His jaw set, his eyes not quite meeting mine. He told me that he and Stacy had been talking about the future, about stability. He said the word equity 3 times in 5 minutes. He said it made financial sense, practically speaking, for me to add him to the deed. Just as a co-owner, he said, nothing changes. I looked at my son for a long moment. I thought about Patricia. I thought about the 31 years of union wages we had poured into that house, the overtime I worked to pay it off early, the party we threw in this very kitchen the day we burned the mortgage. Nothing changes, I repeated back to him. Exactly, he said. I told him I'd think about it. I didn't say yes, but I didn't say no firmly enough, and that was the second mistake. Over the following weeks, Stacy's behavior changed in a way I can only describe as a door opening, like she had been standing outside my house, my actual life, and now believed she had been handed a key. She started going through the mail. Not secretly, openly, right at the kitchen table, flipping through envelopes while I was making coffee. When I mentioned it, she said she was just keeping things organized. She started talking on the phone about our house when I could hear her through the wall. She had her mother over twice without asking me, and her mother walked through every room making comments about what she would do with the space. I started sleeping poorly. I am not a man who has ever had trouble sleeping in my life, but I would lie in that small bedroom, Nolan's old bedroom, where I'd read him Where the Wild Things Are when he was 4 years old, and I would listen to the sounds of my own house and feel like a stranger in it. I called my younger brother, Wendell, in Cleveland, one night, around 11. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which is not like him. When I finished, he said, "Eldon, don't sign anything." That was the most useful advice anyone gave me. The pressure escalated in January of the following year. Stacy brought up the deed again directly, not through Nolan this time. She had printed out paperwork, an actual quitclaim deed. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, Patricia's kitchen table, the oak one we'd bought at an antique fair in Granville, and explained to me in a kind, slow voice why it was the smart thing to do. For tax purposes, for estate planning, so the house wouldn't have to go through probate when I was gone. I looked at that paperwork for a long time. I said, "I'll need to talk to my attorney first." The kindness in her face flickered, just for a second, like a light with a loose connection. "That's fine," she said. Of course, I did call an attorney. A woman named Beverly. No, wait, let me be careful. I'll just say I called an estate attorney, a friend of a friend, someone Patricia had actually found years ago when we did our wills. She looked at the paperwork Stacy had given me and told me very plainly that signing it would give Nolan and Stacy co-ownership of the property, and that as a co-ownership of the property, and that as a co-owner, Stacy, with Nolan, would have the legal right to force a sale through a process called a partition action. She said it calmly, like it was just information. But my hands were cold when I hung up the phone. I did not sign. 2 weeks later, Stacy stopped eating dinner with me. A month after that, Nolan told me they had consulted their own attorney and that the arrangement was no longer working. He used that phrase 3 times too. He said they needed stability, they needed their own space, they needed to make plans. He said, and this is the part I still have trouble saying out loud, that given my age and my health situation, it might make more sense to sell the house and use my share of the proceeds to move me into a senior living community. I am 67 years old. I take a blood pressure medication and a vitamin D supplement. I walk 3 miles every morning through the neighborhood. I split my own firewood in October, a senior living community. No, I said. He started to explain, started to bring out more paperwork. No, I said again. This conversation is over. He left the kitchen. I sat at Patricia's table for a long time in the dark. After that, things moved quickly in a way that felt designed to exhaust me. The heat was turned down at night without my touching the thermostat. My shelf in the refrigerator was moved, my things pushed to the back and crowded out. Stacy began having loud phone conversations near my room early in the morning, right outside the door. Nolan stopped speaking to me directly, communicating through Stacy as if I was someone who needed a translator. One morning I found a real estate brochure on the kitchen counter. Homes for seniors, active living communities in central Ohio. It had been placed there like a suggestion, like inevitability, printed on glossy paper. I called Wendell again. This time he drove down from Cleveland on a Friday night without me even asking him to. He sat in my kitchen and I made us coffee, and we talked until almost 2 in the morning. He told me I needed to document everything. He said it so matter-of-factly that I realized he had been thinking about this longer than I had. "Write things down," he said. "Dates, what was said, who was there, everything." I started keeping a small notebook in my jacket pocket. I wrote in it every day. What I didn't tell Wendell was what I had already started doing 2 months before any of this came to a head. I had been quietly, methodically moving money, not hiding it. There is nothing illegal about a man managing his own finances, but I had spent 31 years in the trades, and I had saved carefully my whole life. And I had accounts Stacy didn't know about and didn't need to know about. Patricia and I had been private people about money. We didn't talk about it at dinner parties. We didn't leave account statements on the counter. It wasn't shame, it was the way we were raised. You didn't tell people what you had. My house had nearly tripled in value since 1989. The neighborhood that Stacy had described as having potential was, according to the Zillow estimate that Nolan had helpfully left open on the shared family laptop one day, worth just under $480,000. Between the house, my pension, my savings accounts, and a brokerage account I had opened years ago on the advice of a fellow union man, I had accumulated, I say this not to boast, I say this because it matters to the story, just under $890,000 in total assets. I drove a 10-year-old Chevy Impala. I bought my suits at J.C. Penney. I had a $40 a month gym membership I used 3 times a week. I did not look like a man with nearly $1 million, and that had always been intentional. Patricia and I agreed on this. Wealth is information, she used to say. You don't owe anyone that information. Stacy, I think, knew there was something. She had looked at the house value. She knew what my union pension paid, but she didn't know the rest. I began, very quietly, to move the liquid assets. Not out of the country, nothing dramatic. I transferred funds to accounts that Wendell had access to as backup, that were solely in my name, that were not connected to any shared household account. I worked with my attorney. I reviewed my will. I updated my beneficiary designations. I made sure that if anything happened to me, everything went exactly where I wanted it to go, and not $1 ended up somewhere I hadn't chosen. Then I waited. The end, when it came, was less dramatic than I'd expected, and more painful than I was prepared for. On a Tuesday in March, Stacy came into the kitchen while I was eating lunch and told me that she and Nolan had made a decision. They were going to pursue a partition action. She had spoken to their attorney. Because I refused to agree to a co-ownership arrangement or a voluntary sale, they would ask the court to force the sale of the house. She said it like she was reading a weather report. She said she was sorry it had come to this. I put down my fork. I looked at her. "Stacy," I said, "this is my house. My wife and I bought this house before your parents were married. My son grew up in this house. Patricia died in this bedroom. Do you understand what you're asking?" She looked at the table. She said it wasn't personal. I called my attorney that afternoon. She told me that in Ohio, a non-owner cannot force a partition action, only a legal co-owner can. Since I had never signed the quitclaim deed, since my name was the only name on that deed, Nolan and Stacy had no legal standing to force anything. Their attorney had either given them bad advice or they had misunderstood something. Either way, it wasn't going anywhere. But I was done. I told Nolan that evening that they had 30 days to find other arrangements. He looked at me like I'd hit him. I felt like I'd been hit for months, but I didn't say that. I just said 30 days. Stacy didn't speak to me for the remainder of their time in the house. That was fine. Nolan tried twice to reopen a conversation, and both times I listened and both times I said the same thing. When you're ready to apologize to me for what's been done in this house, I'm here. Until then, focus on moving. On a Friday morning near the end of April, they loaded the last of their things into a U-Haul. I sat on the front porch and drank coffee and watched them carry boxes down the front steps. The forsythia was blooming again, same as when they'd arrived 2 years before. When the truck was loaded, Nolan came to the porch. He didn't look at me exactly, he looked near me. "I'll call you," he said. "Whenever you're ready," I said. Stacy came out last. She was carrying a box, not one of their boxes, one of mine. One of the boxes I had moved to the front closet when they arrived, full of things from my old home office, framed photos, Patricia's recipe binder, old tax documents, a coffee can I'd used for spare keys and batteries and small things I wanted to keep, but couldn't quite categorize. She held it out without meeting my eyes. "I think this is yours," she said. She wasn't handing it to me gently. She kind of pushed it forward and let go before I had a firm grip, and I caught it awkwardly, and one of the flaps came open. When I looked inside, when I actually stopped and looked, I saw the recipe binder on top, Patricia's handwriting on the spine. Below that, the photos. And tucked underneath, something I had put in there months ago and nearly forgotten about. A standard white business envelope, sealed, addressed to me in Wendell's handwriting. Wendell had mailed it to me in December, after one of our phone calls where I told him about moving the accounts. Inside was a certified letter from the brokerage confirming the transfer of $347,000 into the new account. There was also a handwritten note from Wendell. 2 sentences. "You did the right thing." Patricia would agree. I stood on my porch with that box in my arms, and I watched the U-Haul pull out of the driveway for a long moment. Then I went inside and sat at Patricia's table, and I let myself cry for a while, for the marriage that my son had made, for the 2 years of my house that I couldn't get back, for the conversation I still needed to have with my child when he was ready to have it, for Patricia, who had not lived to see any of this, which was the only genuine mercy in the whole story. When the crying was done, I made myself a cup of coffee. I sat in the quiet. The house sounded like itself again for the first time in 2 years. 4 months later, Nolan called. It was a Sunday. He called in the morning, which he used to do when he was in college, and just wanted to talk. He said he and Stacy had separated. He said he'd had a lot of time to think. He said, and I could hear what it cost him to say it, that he was sorry. Not for everything at once, not the full accounting, but that he was sorry. "I know," I said. "Come over. I'll make dinner." He came. He sat at the kitchen table, his mother's table, and I made the pot roast that Patricia used to make and that I had learned to make after she was gone. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. There was a long road back, and we both knew it, and neither of us pretended otherwise. But we were at the same table. That was enough for one night. I still walk 3 miles every morning through the neighborhood. The Johnsons next door still wave from their driveway. The forsythia will bloom again in the spring. Patricia's vegetable garden is coming back. I've been putting more work into it this year, getting it back to what it was. It's not the same without her. Nothing is. But I've got time, and I've got this house, and the deed has only one name on it. Mine. I think about that cardboard box a lot. The way Stacy let go of it before I had a real grip on it. The way one flap came open and I looked down and saw Patricia's handwriting on the spine of that recipe binder. She didn't know what she was handing me. She thought she was giving me back something worthless. That's the thing about people who confuse kindness with weakness. They always miscalculate. They see a man who drives an old car, who buys his suits off the rack, who doesn't raise his voice, and they decide that man has nothing. They move into his house and start measuring the walls and making plans. And all along they are building on ground that was never theirs to stand on. Stacy and Nolan spent 2 years trying to take something from me, and what they actually did was show me exactly where I stood and exactly who I was dealing with. That's not nothing. That's information. I made mistakes in this. I want to be honest about that. I let things go too long before I said no clearly. I let my love for my son cloud my judgment about what was actually happening in my own home. Patricia would have seen it sooner. She had a sharp eye for that, for the difference between someone who needed help and someone who was using the offer of help as a doorway into something else. I didn't want to see it because seeing it meant accepting something painful about my son, and I wasn't ready for that. But I had also spent 67 years learning things. I had learned to read a situation carefully before I acted. I had learned that when something doesn't feel right, you don't sign your name to it. You make a phone call first. You talk to someone who knows more than you do. You sleep on it 3 nights in a row. I had learned that a man who has kept his business private his whole life has a quiet kind of power that people who operate loudly never expect. None of that happened by accident. It took decades of paying attention, of thinking before speaking, of understanding that patience is not the same thing as passivity. And when it mattered, when Stacy set that deed on Patricia's table and explained it to me in her careful, patient voice, I didn't fold. That steadiness didn't come from nowhere. It came from every hard year I'd worked, every conversation I'd had with my brother at 2 in the morning. Every morning I got up and walked those 3 miles, even when I didn't feel like it. You build the person you need to be before you need to be that person. There's no other way it works. What I carry out of all of this isn't anger. I had some of that. I won't pretend otherwise. But anger is a thing you feel and then, if you're paying attention, you put down. What I carry is a clearer sense of what I owe the people who are truly mine and what I do not owe the people who are not. I owe Nolan the chance to come back to this table and rebuild something. I gave him that. The pot roast was good. He ate 2 plates and didn't say much, and that was exactly right. What I don't owe anyone is this house. It has one name on the deed, and that name belongs to me and to Patricia's memory and to the 33 years we poured into it together. Some things are not negotiable. Knowing which things those are, and holding to that knowledge when the pressure is on, that's the whole game. Wendell said Patricia would agree. He was right. I know exactly what she would have said, standing in that kitchen watching me find that letter in the box. She would have put her hand on my arm and said, very quietly, I told you, you always had it. She did tell me. Many times. I just needed to remember it when it counted.